The lightning storm that burned her barn around her. A Lakota chief carried her through flame. The smell comes back before anything else. Not the smoke. Something before the smoke, the way the air turned, that particular heaviness that settles over the plains when a storm is building itself out west, stacking up like a wall that God Himself is putting together, stone by stone. I know that smell. My people have always known it. It carries iron and distance, and something that has no word in either of our languages, something that just means, tonight the sky will break open, and what is underneath it will answer. I had ridden out past the ridge that runs north of Elk Creek because one of the young men, Chayton, my sister's boy, had spotted a figure on the Haverson land 2 days running, moving along the fence line after sundown. There had been trouble that summer with men from the railroad, surveyors mostly, but not only surveyors, men with legal papers and bad intentions and the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. I had told the council I would look myself, that it was nothing, probably. That I would look anyway. It was not nothing. But that is not where this starts. This starts with a horse I did not recognize, standing in the draw below the Haverson rise, ears back, pulling hard at its rope. A good horse. A nervous horse. I stopped my own animal and sat a moment, watching the sky. The storm was still maybe 2 hours out, maybe 3. The kind of distance that tricks you into thinking you have time when in fact you have none at all. I tied my horse to a cedar and went up the rise on foot. From the top I could see the whole of the Haverson place, maybe 400 yards off. The house with its single lantern burning in the east window, the chicken coop, the water tank on its wooden tower. And the barn, the big one, the one old Magnus Haverson had built with his own hands, and 3 hired men back before the trouble, before Magnus died of a fever the winter before last, before his wife Margaret had been left alone out here with 200 and some acres and a Norwegian stubbornness that was half her inheritance and half the reason she was still here at all when every other homesteader in 20 miles had sold out or run. I did not know Margaret Haverson then, not really. I knew of her the way a man knows things about the land around him, the way you know where a creek runs low in August or where the deer cross at first light. She had been here. She had stayed. Her husband was dead. She kept the lights burning. That was the sum of what I knew. I was still watching the place, thinking about that horse in the draw and whether it belonged to a railroad man or something worse, when the lightning came. Not 1 strike, not 2. It hit that barn 3 times in the space of a long breath, and I have seen lightning my whole life. I was born in a storm. My mother always said the thunder was how I announced myself, but I have never seen anything like what the sky did to that barn. The first strike blew the weather vane clean off the peak. The second caught the hayloft. And the third was personal. That is the only word I have for it. It was as if the storm had decided on that barn specifically, had been building itself all day for exactly this, and now it was done deciding. The fire took the south wall in seconds. I was already running. I don't think about it much, the running. My people are not strangers to fire. You learn early what fire does, how it moves, that it is alive in a way that has nothing to do with spirits or ceremony, and everything to do with wind direction and dry wood and the particular hunger that lives inside it. I knew before I reached the fence line that the barn was finished. I knew the question was not the barn. The question was what was inside it. I went through the fence the fast way, which is to say I went through it, and I could hear her before I saw her. Not screaming. That is the first thing I should say about Margaret Haverson. She was not screaming. She was calling out, that controlled kind of calling that a person does when they are frightened and choosing not to be frightened, when they are keeping their voice level by an act of pure will because they know that panic will kill you faster than fire. She was calling the animals. There were horses in that barn. 3 of them I found out later. She had gotten 2 out before the loft went. The third one, a sorrel mare, young, Margaret had foaled her herself 3 springs back, was still in the far stall, and the far stall was now behind a wall of smoke and a burning crossbeam that had come down across the center aisle. Margaret was standing at the barn door with a soaking wet feed sack over her head, and she was about to go back in. I caught her arm. She spun on me. The wet sack fell back off her face, and she looked at me the way a person looks when they are too focused on one terrible thing to process another thing happening beside it. Her eyes went to my hand on her arm and then to my face, and I saw the recognition, not of me specifically, but of what I was, a Lakota man, and I saw the fear move through her, and then I saw her put the fear down like a tool she decided she didn't need right now. She said, "There's a horse in there." I said, "I know, don't go in." She said, "I'm going in." I said, "No." And then I took the wet sack off her head and put it on mine, and I went in. I want to say it was a grand thing, a thing a man tells as a great deed. But the truth is what I remember most is the heat, the way it pressed against every inch of skin like a hand, and the sound fire is loud. People don't tell you how loud it is. It roars the way a river roars in flood, and underneath the roaring you can hear individual things dying, individual pieces of wood giving up their shape. And the mare was screaming now, a horse in full panic, which is a sound that goes into you somewhere below thought. The crossbeam was burning, but it had not burned through yet. I got low under the worst of the smoke and I moved fast. The stall was at the far end, and the far end was bright, not with lantern light, with the fire coming through the wall from outside, and the mare was against the back of the stall, whites of her eyes showing, nostrils wide. A horse in that state will kill you as readily as the fire. I have gentled horses my whole life. I know what a horse needs in that moment, which is one voice and one smell it can fix on, something that isn't smoke and terror. I talked to her, I don't know what I said. Something low, something without stops in it, a continuous sound that said, "I am here, I am calm, follow the calm." It took longer than I had. I knew it took longer than I had. But you cannot rush a horse out of that kind of fear. You can only lead it, and so I led, and she came, stumbling, pressing against me so hard, she nearly put me down twice in the aisle. And I kept my hand on her neck and kept moving and kept talking in that low, continuous sound. We came out through the barn door, and the cold air hit like a wall going the other direction, and the mare tore away from me the moment she felt the open space and ran, trailing her halter rope, toward the water tank at the far end of the yard. She would be all right. I knew it before I could see it. I straightened up and pulled the wet sack off my head, and Margaret Haverson was standing where I had left her, and she was looking at me. And the barn behind me was fully gone now, fully committed to its ending, roaring and cracking, and sending up a column of light that you could probably have seen from Elk Creek. She had a burn on her left forearm. She hadn't mentioned it. I don't think she had noticed it yet. I said, "You're burned." She looked at her arm like she was seeing it for the first time. Then she looked back at me. She said, "You went back in for my horse." I said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" I didn't have a fast answer for that. I looked at the fire, I thought about it. I said, "Because you were going to." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come inside, I'll put something on that." I didn't know I was burned until she said it, which is how burns work sometimes. My left shoulder where the crossbeam had been closest. Not bad, but real. I followed her inside. The house was small and very clean. That is what I noticed first. Not the furnishings, not the photographs on the shelf, not the Bible on the table that was worn at the spine in the way that means it has been used and not just kept. The cleanliness. The particular effort of a person living alone who refuses to let the place go, who sweeps and wipes and sets things straight because order is a kind of company when you have no other kind. I know that kind of cleanliness. I have seen it in the lodges of men who have lost their wives. There is something both honorable and heartbreaking in it. She had a tin of salve and clean strips of cloth, and she did the burn on my shoulder first, which I had not asked her to, and she had not asked me if she could. She just did it. Her hands were sure. Not gentle exactly, I don't mean it the soft way. I mean they didn't shake and they didn't hesitate. She had done this kind of thing before. She worked without speaking, and I sat on the bench by the door and let her. Then she did her own arm. I watched her do it. She tied off the cloth strip with her teeth because she only had the one free hand. She said, "I'm Margaret Haverson." I said, "I know who you are." She looked at me, not unfriendly, assessing. She said, "And you are?" I told her my name. The short version, the one I use with people who don't speak Lakota, which is more of an approximation than a name but close enough for a first evening. She said it back to me, not perfectly, but she tried. Then she said, "You were watching the place, before the storm." It was not a question, she had seen me. I had not known she had seen me. I said, "There was a horse in the draw below the ridge. I wanted to know who it belonged to." She said, "Railroad man, he left this afternoon." A pause. "They've been sending them every week or so." I said, "I know." She looked at me again. Longer this time, she said, "The land." I said, "The land." The storm was directly overhead now. It was hammering the roof, which was a good solid sound because it was a good solid roof, and through the window you could see the barn's last light fading as the rain took it down. She watched the window for a while. Then she made coffee, which is something a person does when they need to move their hands. She said, "The mare, what's her name, did I tell you?" I said she had not. She said, "Frida." My husband named her. He was Norwegian. She set the coffee pot on the stove with a click. He would have gone in after her too. She said it plain, without ceremony, which is the only way true things can be said. It was not a comparison. It was not flattery. It was just a fact she was putting on the table, the way you put down a tool when you're done using it, or a stone when you're done carrying it. I thought of Magnus Haverson, whom I had never met, who had built the barn that was now a black ruin out there in the rain. I thought about what it costs a person to stay on land alone after the one who built things alongside you is gone. I said, "He built the barn well. It took 3 strikes." She looked at me. And she smiled, which was not something I was expecting and which changed the whole temperature of the room. Not a wide smile. Small, quick, mostly in the eyes, but real. She said, "Yes, he did." I did not leave that night. The storm made the decision first. You don't ride through a storm like that, not on ground that turns to mud that fast, not without being able to see your horse's ears in front of you. But even after the storm broke, sometime past midnight, even after the rain softened to a drizzle and the stars began to come back one at a time, I did not ride. Margaret Haverson did not ask me to stay. She did not ask me to go. She put a blanket on the bench by the door and said, "The floor's harder," and went to the back room and closed the door, which was both practical and a kind of trust I was aware of without putting words to it. I lay on the bench and listened to the rain come down and thought about the mare, who was probably at the water tank or the chicken coop or somewhere dry and dumb and content in the way horses are when the crisis has passed and they've already forgotten it. I thought about the railroad man in the draw. I thought about the barn, which was not fixable, which was a significant loss that I did not yet know how to calculate for a woman trying to keep 200 acres running alone. I thought about her hands, not in the wrong way. The practical way, the way a person thinks about tools. Sure hands. Hands that had done real work and would do more of it. Hands that didn't shake when a barn was burning behind them. I fell asleep, which surprised me. In the morning she made biscuits. Let me tell you about the weeks that followed, because that is where the real story lives, not in the fire, not in the one dramatic night, but in what came after it. I came back the next day. The day after that. I brought 2 of my men, Chayton and an older man named Runs Far, and we began to clear the ruin of the barn. It is the kind of work that needs hands, and Margaret Haverson needed hands, and I had them to give. That was the whole logic of it at the start. She did not ask why I came back. She came out when she heard the horses, and she assessed the situation, and she went and got her own work gloves and her own tools, and she worked alongside us. Not directing and not deferring. Alongside. Chayton was 22 and had never worked alongside a white woman, and he kept looking at me sideways, waiting for some signal about how to behave. I gave him none because there was no signal needed. You work. That is the signal. By the third day she had sent to town for lumber. The order was larger than she could afford. I found out later, but she had made the calculation and decided the risk was worth it. By the sixth day, we had the foundation posts in. Runs Far, who is 71 years old and has built more lodges than he can count, had opinions about the framing, and he and Margaret had a long argument about roof pitch that neither of them lost, and neither of them won, and that ended in a compromise that Runs Far privately conceded was probably stronger than his original plan. She fed us, every day. Real food, not the apologetic kind, biscuits in the morning and whatever she had in the afternoon, rabbit stew mostly, and once a beef roast that she must have been saving for a specific occasion and had apparently decided this was it. I watched her with my men. The way she spoke direct, no performance in it, no flattery and no condescension. She looked at Chayton like he was a man doing a man's work, which is what he was, which is what his own uncertainty about himself sometimes made him forget. I watched him notice this. I watched him stand up a little straighter. Runs Far she treated like what he was, which was the most experienced builder present. She listened to him. Not the polite listening that people sometimes do with old men waiting for them to finish. The real kind. The kind where you take what someone says and hold it a moment and consider it before you answer. Runs Far noticed this too. He told me on the fourth evening in Lakota without looking at me that she was not what he had expected. I said, no. He said, this is a woman who builds things. I said, yes. I did not say what else I was thinking, which was that she had been building things alone for a long time, and that there was something in the set of her shoulders that knew it, that carried it, and that the knowing cost her something she paid every day without complaining about the price. The barn was up in 3 weeks, not the full barn that would take the rest of the summer, but the main structure, the roof, the stalls, enough to bring the horses in out of the weather. The day the roof went on, Margaret Haverson stood in the center of the new barn and looked up at it for a long time. Then she said, my husband would have wanted it taller. I said, it's tall. She said he always wanted everything taller. Not sad exactly, a fact again, a fact with warmth in it. The kind of warmth that sits right next to grief, that doesn't stop grief from being what it is, but lives there alongside it. She looked at me. She said, I have been thinking about the railroad men. I said, so have I. She said, they will come back. The papers they're carrying, I've had a lawyer look at the language. It's not a legal claim yet, but it's on the way to becoming one. I said, I know. She said, I cannot fight it alone. I mean I can, but I mean I cannot win it alone. This is the part I think about most when I think about Margaret Haverson, which is more often than I have told anyone. She did not ask me to help. She laid a situation out plainly and let it sit there between us, and she looked at me with those gray eyes that don't perform anything, that just see, and she waited. I said, you're not alone. She was quiet for a moment. The horses moved in the new stalls. Frida knocked her nose against the slat of her door, which she did when she was bored, which was most of the time. Margaret said, no, I suppose I'm not. What happened with the railroad men is a longer story, a legal story, and it has other people in it besides us. And I'm not going to give it to you all at once because that's not how I'm telling this. What I'll tell you is that between my people's claim to the land north of her fence line, a claim we had in writing, treaty writing, which the railroad men did not love to see, and a Norwegian woman who had been born argumentative and sharpened herself further in 10 years of frontier winters, the railroad men eventually found other ground to survey. The lawyer in town told Margaret that in 40 years of practice, He had never seen a negotiation where both parties were more certain they were right. Margaret told the lawyer that one of the parties was right, and left. She told me this over coffee, which had become a kind of ritual, not a scheduled one. Nothing was scheduled but a regular one, the way water finds its own channel. I would come by every few days, or she would ride up to the creek where my camp was, and there would be coffee and there would be talking. And sometimes there was work and sometimes there was not, and neither of us made a large thing of any of it. I am aware that there were people on both sides of that fence line, and in the town 12 miles east, who made a large thing of it in our absence. I am aware of what was said. I am not going to give those people the weight of much discussion here, because they do not deserve it, and because Margaret Haverson's response to the first piece of gossip that found its way to her was to look at the person who delivered it and say, "And," in a tone of voice that made very clear that the response was expected to be substantial, and when it wasn't, she walked away. That was the end of that for her. I followed her lead. Chayton asked me about her once. He is a young man and he asked in the way young men ask, which is sideways and indirect and trying to locate the feeling before they've figured out the words for it. I let him get there at his own pace. When he finally asked what he was actually asking, which was what she was to me, I thought about it honestly. I said, she is someone who stayed on hard land and built things on it and did not ask the land to be different than it was. I said, I respect that more than most things. He nodded like he understood. I think he did. What I didn't say, because Chayton was 22, and there are things you don't say to 22-year-olds because they are not equipped to receive them yet, is that Margaret Haverson had given me something I didn't know I was missing until she gave it, which was the particular weight of being known by someone who had no reason to know you, who had seen you do one true thing on one terrible night, and had decided based on that one thing to keep looking. A chief is known by his people. A warrior is known by his deeds. These are real things. I do not diminish them. But to be known by a stranger, to have a gray-eyed woman who had just watched her barn burn down look at you on a bench in her kitchen while she tied off a bandage with her teeth and decide, without ceremony, without drama, to trust you, that is a different thing. I did not have a word for it in either language. I still don't. But I felt the shape of it, the specific shape of it, the way you feel a stone in your hand and know it by its weight and not its name. The summer turned. The land dried out and the grass went gold the way plains grass does. That particular deep gold that looks like the ground is trying to give some of the sun back. Frida had her second foal, which Margaret had been watching for, and which arrived on a Tuesday morning before either of us was fully awake. I had stayed the night in the barn, which I had done 3 or 4 times by then, on a cot near the far stall, and we stood in the stall doorway, both of us, watching the foal find its legs in that ungainly determined way that foals have, all tendon and trust. Margaret said, Magnus always said there was nothing in the world like that. I said he was right. She looked at me sideways, that quick look she has, the assessing one. She said, you don't say he was right about things very often. I said, I say it when it's true. She almost smiled. The almost smile is something I had learned to watch for, the moment before it arrives, which is somehow more hers than the smile itself. The foal made it to its feet on the 3rd try. In September, the treaty negotiations started again, and I was needed at the agency, and then north, and then at a council that ran 3 weeks and settled nothing except who would speak next, which is sometimes all a council can accomplish. I was gone 6 weeks in total. I did not send word to Margaret Haverson because there was no easy way to send word, and because I did not think in those first weeks that she would be expecting it. She was not waiting. I knew she would not be waiting. She is not a woman who waits. She is a woman who works, who moves, who decides. But when I came back down the creek trail in the last week of September and rode up to the fence line, she came out of the house within a minute of my horse arriving at the gate. And she came out at the kind of pace that is not quite running, but is what you do when you have decided not to run. She looked at me the way she had looked at me that first night, Not the frightened look. The other one. The one where she takes in what's in front of her and decides what it is. She said, "You look thin." I said, "Council food." She said, "Come inside." I did. Over coffee she asked about the negotiations, not in the performed interested way that people sometimes do, but in the way she asked about roof pitch, in the way she asked about anything, because she actually wanted to know, because she was going to do something with the information, because the situation and its outcome mattered to her in a real and specific way. I told her the truth of it, which was not a pleasant truth. She listened to all of it. She did not offer false comfort. She said, "That's not good enough." I said, "No," she said. "What do you need?" I told her. She thought about it. She said, "The lawyer who helped with the railroad paper. He has a connection in Washington. It's a small connection, but small is not nothing." I looked at her. She said, "I'll write to him." I said, "You don't have to do that." She looked at me with those gray eyes, the no-performance eyes, the eyes that have seen a barn burn and a foal born and 6 weeks of an empty fence line, and have not asked any of those things to be different than they were. She said, "I know I don't have to." The letter she wrote took 4 drafts and about a week. I know because I was there for some of it. She would read pieces aloud and I would say what was wrong and she would fix it, and I would say nothing and she would read it again and find something else to fix. She has a particular sound when she's dissatisfied with her own work, a single short exhale through her nose, not quite a scoff. I learned to wait for it. The 4th draft she folded and sealed and set on the table. She said, "It's the best I can do." I said, "It's good." She said, "You haven't read it." I said, "I heard it, it's good." She looked at the letter, then she looked at me. She said, "When you went in after Frida, the night of the fire, were you afraid?" The question surprised me, not because it was strange, but because she had held it for 4 months and asked it now, over a letter on the table, in the plain kitchen light of a September evening. I thought about it honestly. I said, "For a moment, the crossbeam." She nodded. She said, "I was afraid when I thought you weren't coming back out." She said it the same way she said everything. Plain, no decoration, like a fact she was putting on the table. I held it a moment. I said, "I came back out." She said, "Yes, you did." A pause. The horses moved outside. The lamp threw its small circle of light and everything beyond it was the dark of a September evening, which is a particular blue dark, deep and close, the kind of dark that makes a lit room feel like a country all its own. She said, "I think you should know that." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me, it's just true. I am going to tell you how this ends, which is how all things that matter end. Not with a single moment, not with one deed or one night or one fire, but with the accumulation of small true things until the weight of them becomes a kind of gravity that holds 2 people in the same orbit. Winter came, and I spent more of it on her land than off it. There was work, and that was real, a windmill that needed repair, fencing that the fall storms had damaged, firewood that needed to be laid in for a quantity of weeks that she would not have managed to calculate correctly alone, not because she was not capable of calculating, but because she was working too hard on 5 other things to have stopped and done the arithmetic. I did the arithmetic. I split wood until my shoulders ached in a way I had not felt since I was young enough to still be proving myself, which is its own kind of pleasure. Runs Far said I was building something. He said it in Lakota so that only I could hear, and he was watching a fence line at the time so his eyes never came to me. I said, "Maybe." He said, "She is the kind of woman a man builds something with." I said, "Yes." He said, "Magnus Haverson was a lucky man." Then, after a pause, very dry in most respects, I said nothing. He almost smiled, which for Runs Far is the equivalent of laughing until he couldn't breathe. She asked me once what my people thought. I said they thought what they thought. Some of them were cautious. Some of them were curious. Chayton was cautious and curious both. Runs far, who had seen 71 winters and had stopped investing his judgment in what he could not control, had no opinion that he shared with anyone except me. I asked her what the town thought. She said, "The town thinks what it likes. The town thought I was foolish for staying after Magnus died. The town thought the railroad men had a legitimate claim. The town was wrong about both." She looked at me. "I don't let the town think for me." I said, "No, I know you don't." She said, "Do you care what they think?" I thought about that, honestly. I said, "I care about my people, what they need, what serves them, what protects them. What a town 12 miles east thinks about my life." I paused. "No." She nodded, the same nod she gives when she's decided something is confirmed. She said, "Good. The night I am going to end on is not the fire. The fire is where it started, but it is not the shape of the thing. The shape of the thing is smaller and quieter, and belongs to a January evening when the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that makes the air crystalline, that makes sounds carry farther than they should, that makes everything outside the circle of lamplight feel very far away." I had been working on the north fence most of the day, and I came in cold, which I don't often let myself be. But the cold that day was serious and final in the way January cold can be, and Margaret opened the door before I reached it, which meant she had been watching for me, which I noted and did not remark on. Inside she had soup on the stove and the lamp up high and the fire in the hearth built the right way, the slow burn way, the way that lasts. I sat at the table and I was cold in the deep way, the bone way, and she brought the soup and set it down, and then she did something she had not done before, which was to sit down across from me and put both her hands flat on the table, not reaching for anything, just present. Both hands, flat on the wood. And she said, "I want you to know something." I waited. She said, "When the barn burned, when you went in, I stood outside and I counted." She looked at her hands on the table. "I counted from the moment you went in to the moment you came back out. I don't know why I counted, I just counted." She looked up at me. "I don't count like that for most things." I looked at her hands on the table. I put one of mine next to hers, not over it, next to it, close. She looked at my hand next to hers. Then she looked at me. Gray eyes, the no-performance eyes, the eyes that have been looking at me honest and straight since a burning barn and a wet feed sack and a question. "Why?" She turned her hand over, slow, and set it in mine. Outside the cold was doing what January cold does, pressing down on the land, stilling everything, making the night enormous and the lit room small. Frida was in the barn, safe, bored, knocking her nose against the stall slat. The north fence was repaired. The wood was stacked. The letter to Washington had been answered briefly and not promisingly, but answered, which was a beginning. I held her hand and I thought about what Runs Far had said, that she was the kind of woman a man builds something with. And I thought about Magnus Haverson, who had built a barn that took 3 lightning strikes to fall. And I thought about this woman who had stayed on hard land and refused to let things go and counted the seconds when a man went into a burning building, and had told me about it in January without ornament, just the plain truth of it. I thought, I know what I am to my people. I know what I have been in councils and on the trail and in the smoke of difficult decisions. I know what competence and steadiness earn a man among men who judge by those things. I had not expected to know, also, what it was to matter to one woman in one lit room in a January night, to have that particular weight, her hand in mine, her gray eyes steady on my face, a whole summer and autumn of small true things piled up between us like stones laid right, to know that weight and know it was mine, earned, solid, real. I held her hand. The fire in the hearth burned the way she had built it, long and sure and slow. Outside the cold pressed down on all that dark land, and inside the lamp burned, and we sat. That is where the story lives, not the fire here, in the quiet after. In a woman's hand in mine that was given freely, and what it was worth, and the fact that I knew exactly what it was worth, which is the only way to receive a thing like that correctly. The lamp burned. And that was enough.